Hi everyone. This video I'm going to talk about the Venus retrograde that starts on May 13th and talking a little bit about some of the themes that she'll be bringing up, what that journey looks like, and a little as well as some of the mythology and other more illustrative aspects that she brings up during this process. I personally love Venus. Both my luminaries, my sun and my moon, are ruled by Venus in my natal chart, and so she has a lot of influence over the ways that I think and I feel and I prioritize around how I move and where my values find themselves. The Venus cycle is actually one of the oldest studied cycles outside of the sun and the moon. The Mayans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, they were all fascinated by Venus, by how she danced around the sky and seemed to change positions in relation to the sun. Some seasons she does appear in the morning, and some seasons in the evening. And she's so bright in the sky that her movements were more trackable. So she's linked to many of the goddess traditions and is actually the only female feminine named planet among the traditional planets that we currently have and access. So she is, of course, associated with connection, with love and benefits. And she's also one of the key things that we look at when we're assessing relationship in the natal chart. She rules both Taurus and Libra, and so she also has interest in comforts, in beauty, in diplomacy, in peacemaking, earthly material stability and relations, as well as pleasures and justice. The Venus retrograde happens this year. It does not happen every year, but it happens this year in the sign of Gemini, and she stations retrograde on May 13th, and I believe at 2:45 a.m. Eastern time, which is where all these times are. That's where I am. And she stations retrograde at 21 degrees of Gemini. And then she'll be in retrograde for 40 days and station direct on June 25th at 5 degrees of Gemini. So her retrograde cycle lasts for 40 days. And many traditions, many faiths have located within their beliefs and their practices a 40-day period of something, whether it's 40 days of fasting, 40 days of prayer, 40 days of giving up, 40 days in the desert, 40 years in the wilderness. There's a 40 tradition. So there's a sense of the sacred in her return and this time period during this phase that she reviews, that she turns inward. And potentially she has to redo and go over again, rethink, renegotiate where and how she is. These 40 periods are associated, I think, with a sense of simplicity and of releasing some of our external brilliance in order to gain some internal insight or revelation. It's a space to make space to be spoken to hear, and to see, and to feel reality differently, which will, of course, change how we relate to the world and how we're then perceived after we come out of that transition. I would encourage you, if thinking of this kind of 40-day period, or anytime we're thinking of giving up or moving into simplicity, that idea of not really focusing so much on the giving up, but about replacing or backwards addition. For instance, I'm taking away 5% of this thing occupying my time and my thoughts so that I can add 5% of this other thing that I deeply desire, but that can come out of focus in my day-to-day life, perhaps because it's so deep. And so what desires are buried down there that you would like to give a voice to, or you would like to have themselves express more in your life? Focus on what you're adding and not what you're subtracting. There may need to be less phone time, or I may need to be more, I need to be less on this never-ending conveyor belt with work in order to give more time for these things to surface and have more of a place. So it sort of moves it moves what we don't want out of the way by becoming more prominent with what we do want. Venus is literally changing position during this retrograde period. She'll actually re-emerge on the other side of the sun and closer to the earth, more concerned with the matters of the earth. And through contact with the sun, she will conjunct the sun and she will emerge the morning star, whereas right now she appears as the evening star. In a story linked to Mayan mythology, the Venus retrograde is associated with her entering the underworld. And in other mythology, she shows up in this way as well. There, in the underworld, Venus encounters the sun and then inflames within the heart of the sun, and she emerges a warrior, ready for battle, willing to fight for the things that she believes in: peace and justice and beauty and right relations. Because Venus will be so close to the sun during her retrograde period, or under the beams, while she's shining so brightly right now in the western sky in the evening, she will in fact not be visible as she gets closer and eventually conjuncts the sun. Her experience makes her invisible for a while. And while she's invisible and conjuncts the sun, she will actually be closer to the earth than when she was visible earlier. So sight doesn't necessarily equal closeness. It makes me think a lot of the myth of Eros and Psyche, where Psyche is punished with wanting to see, with wanting to know her beloved. She wanted to see, and she revealed her beloved's presence in the middle of the night so that she could see his face, and she was punished by he left, really. And then the goddess Aphrodite, who was also jealous of her beauty, sent her on many quests. And one of her quests was to descend into the underworld and steal some of Persephone's beauty. Persephone being another maiden who was stolen and makes partial life for herself in the underworld, which is a story for a different time. But to have and to also see the underworld is required in order to have and to also see. There's a change in the person, in the container of the self. That change is required to not just see, but also to hold the revelation that the sight reveals. I like to think of all the characters in the story as kind of different aspects of the self instead of three distinct characters with different agendas. Or perhaps something more entangled, where they move in and out of being distinct and merged within the self. Where do we want to see? Where we want to be seen? Where are we jealous? Where are the quests? What part of the underworld transformation is necessary in order to hold the things that we want to see and manifest and have in the world? Where can we surrender, and where can we potentially show up more to the inward journey over these next 40 days? And it may look like we aren't showing up that much externally. But when we reemerge, we will have a whole new relationship to self, which of course changes our relationship to others. And potentially we'll have more energy, more willpower, more strength and courage to be in the world and affect change. During this retrograde, Venus will be in a sign-based square to Neptune in Pisces. And she will also be in a sign-based square to Mars, who will enter Pisces also on May 13th, the day that she stations retrograde. So these aspects kind of input a relationship with things not being as they seem, for better or for worse, and perhaps our intuition feels a bit cloudy. Perhaps the clarity around what we want, what we're reviewing, what we're asking for feels murky. And Mars wants to march on, move forward, decide, act, and there's a sense of Venus underneath Mars, forcing her to make choices and move perhaps when she's not ready, or if it's unclear where or how to move. So that perhaps she's I think of it like her movement pattern will be going close and in and under. So it's perhaps like she's going into to train, to emerge this blazing, beautiful, bold warrior. And Mars is kind of like a coach who may be a bit too hard on her, actually. And a prescription for Mars, or a mantra to reinforce agency, for during that underworld process: don't force anything. If it's not ready, it's not ready. If there's this voice that's you gotta move, you gotta work harder, you gotta work faster, don't force it, because you'll create a timeline of forcing. And so know that there may be this voice or this energy that's wanting to force movement and decision and action, while perhaps there's a deep part of the self that is needing to retreat from this external brilliance for a moment in order to have a new emergence of the self that will be more lasting. Venus's journey will be happening in the sign of Gemini, which will be getting a lot of action and occupation this month with the co-presence of the North Node. Mercury will be moving into there, the Sun, the Moon, all moving towards Gemini, or some of them already in Gemini towards the latter end of the month. So Gemini is a mutable air sign, and as I spoke in my longer talk about the nodes in my other video, Gemini is interested in curiosity, in facts, flexibility, the permission and the ability to change one's mind in response to new information, new relationships, new input. So Venus is undergoing her journey of transformation and change in a sign that's very good at change and transmutation. In alchemy, the sign for Gemini was associated with digestion. So there's a churning and a processing, this kind of yes to this, no to this. Keep this, we're not going to keep that. This kind of discussion going on, relaying information, processing, digesting, and making up your mind in response to things, changing your mind in response to things. Think every time you eat, your digestion triggers anew. So it's a good moment to think about renegotiating boundaries. Mutable signs are not that great with structure in general, more or less, with some varied exceptions, and boundaries can be a part of that. So what processes are precious enough to be guarded and to be maintained? And what needs to be guarded in order for the process to take place that feels precious? For instance, what is the metaphor for I need the light to stay on while I go into the underworld so that I can know where to come back up? Sacrificing this external presentation for the sake of authentic transformation. When we're talking about matters of justice and renegotiating ways that we relate to each other, here in the United States, there was a murder in February. It brings to mind in a big deal Ahmaud Arbery's story. It's been sitting very heavily on my heart. If you don't know, he was a 25-year-old African-American man who was just out for a jog, and he was shot in cold blood by two white men who were not even arrested for 2 months. Nobody did anything. The local authorities did absolutely nothing for something that was just a straight up hate crime. And this is not a unique incident in the United States, unfortunately. It is a tragedy, and it is a crime that is supported and maintained by systemic racism. Not just by the people who committed the murder, but the people who committed the crime of not arresting them and doing anything about it or pursuing justice. This is a huge way that we relate as a collective that is manifested in this event, and it's deeply flawed, it is criminal, it is violent, it is unjust, not to mention heartbreaking. It is a broken way of relating. And in order to heal, in order to repair, to even attempt to rebuild the system that upholds and maintains these kinds of injustices, we have to change how we relate. And as I spoke about earlier, this justice, this peace, this relational repair, these are topics with which Venus is concerned. So what can we analyze? What can we call into question? The ways in which we support these kinds of systems, either with our actions that we do overtly or with our non-actions. The ways that we speak with our words or with our silence. What do we support by not saying anything? And can we be open to what change is needed in order to change how we relate to this system, who we vote for, who shows up, and what we will not tolerate, and how can we work more towards a just way of relating and being together on this planet that serves the liberation of everyone. So to me, that is a big Venus topic, and it relates very much, I think, to this underworld journey, these ways of relating and the things that we can call into question and renegotiate during this process. The house that Gemini occupies in your chart, as well as the mutable signs in general, will likely be the topics that come up for you during this retrograde period. They will be interspersed during that. So if you are familiar with the house system, that would be something to look up. If not, I will link a copy to a chart where you can see what house Gemini is for you and what topics those relate to below. I'm currently reading Underland by Robert McFarlane, in which he deals only with the world beneath the ground in various ways: caving, mining, soil, and the fungi networks, and the invisible underground cities, catacombs. And when he's discussing the invisible city under Paris, he speaks of Walter Benjamin, who chronicled a very extensive history of Paris, but from the view of the people instead of the rulers. It's very mutable, it's not chronological. And when he gets to where he's writing about the subterranean city underneath Paris, and just kind of the interesting mirror of those two in relationship to each other, I'll actually the book, he talks about like these gestures that we want to make before we go into the underworld. So before you dive into the invisible city, we want to make some sign to the world that we're leaving when a threshold to the underworld is traversed. As if, like, I think that's lovely advice, and I think it's really pertinent to this moment. Make a sign to the world that I'm going down for a bit. Let the domestic deities know that you're coming, that you're leaving, or you're transitioning. I'll be back. Leave the candle on for me. It's okay to take space in that way. And deep, authentic, necessary change requires something of our externals to shift or be less attended to in that moment in order for us to really change. So most importantly, during this process, I want you to have a lot of grace for yourself. Be open to hard questions and be open to soft answers. Be open to wisdom. If there is a lack of clarity, that is okay. If something felt sure yesterday, but it doesn't feel so sure today, that is okay. How can you change your course for today? How can you let it be okay that you want to change your mind? What new information can you be open to, even or especially if that's information inside of yourself? So if you would like some more prompts for working with the Venus retrograde that you can explore on your own, whether that's through journaling or a creative practice or some kind, you can find those at the link below. And Godspeed.